Hello, APUSHers. I took all of my videos from my content review playlist, cut out all the intros and outros, and put them in chronological order for a mega content review. If you want to skip to specific topics, they're in the video notes below and timestamped. You'll notice I try to combine historical thinking skills like continuity change over time, contextualization, compare contrast, and causation into my content review videos. This is to review content while utilizing these skills and mimic the types of questions a College Board essay prompt might focus on. Our first skill is going to be causation, and our first topic is the Declaration of Independence. So what were the causes of the Declaration of Independence? I'm not going to cover every single cause, but we'll highlight several of them and the flow of events that led up to the Declaration of Independence. To start off, the cause of the Declaration of Independence, we need to go back to the previous war and the beginning of Period 3, the French and Indian War. This war was fought between the French and their Indian allies versus the British and their Indian allies. This was a global conflict, but for U.S. history, we are most concerned with the struggle for the control of the Ohio River Valley, which lies west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British won the war, but it was very costly, and they're going to need some extra revenue. Now let's take a look at how things will change for colonists. Before the war, the American colonists enjoyed a degree of autonomy under a system of salutary neglect, in which the British allowed the colonists to run many of its own affairs in the colonies, including self-government, albeit with British oversight. The British were also lax in its enforcement of mercantilist laws like the Navigation Acts. In a mercantilist system, the colonies are supposed to be a resource and tax base for the mother country. However, the American colonists skirted a lot of these laws through smuggling. After the war, all of this changed as the British became far more hands-on in the governing of their colonies. Let's take a look at the restrictions of colonist movement as a cause for the Declaration of Independence. One of the first acts to draw the ire of colonists was the Proclamation Act of 1763, which forbid colonists from moving across the Appalachian Mountains. This impacted settlers looking to farm the rich soil of the Ohio River Valley and fur traders looking to trap animals in the region. Later on, the Quebec Act passed, which was a part of a series of acts the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts. There were now a number of former Frenchmen in the British North American colonies after the British had defeated the French in the earlier war we discussed. The French were mostly Catholic, so the British extended the colony of Quebec, which was a Catholic colony. This angered the largely Protestant British colonists. Again, I'm only going to just hit upon some of the taxes and laws that were passed in addition to some of the colonial responses. This is by no means comprehensive. In 1762, the writs of assistance were passed, which gave government officials the ability to search without warrants with the goal of trying to end smuggling. Along with the previously mentioned proclamation line in 1763, the British set about to more strictly enforce the Navigation Acts and the mercantilist system by restricting the colonial trade with only Great Britain. In 1765, the first Quartering Act was passed, and there will be another one with the Intolerable Acts later on. The Quartering Acts meant that the colonists may have to room and board British soldiers on their own dime. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which meant taxes on official papers, legal documents, and newspapers. Colonists would protest this Stamp Act with the Stamp Act Congress, and they were successful, and it was repealed. However, it was replaced with the Townshend Acts, which the colonists then boycotted. In 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred, which was a colonial protest in Boston at a customs house. The stories of the event and who was to blame differ, but shots were fired by British soldiers and several colonists died. Paul Revere would create an engraving of the event, which was used as anti-British propaganda. A few years later was the 1773 Tea Act, which actually reduced the tax on the British India Tea Company. So why complain? Well, it gave a monopoly to the tea company, and it had an advantage against the colonist black market tea. This also leads to the Boston Tea Party. In 1774, the Intolerable Acts were passed, which closed the Boston Harbor. Town meetings were restricted. There was a new Quartering Act, and the Quebec Act was all a part of them, which we previously mentioned. In 1775 and 1776, there were several colonial responses to the Intolerable Acts. Colonies sent representatives to the Continental Congress, which drafted the Olive Branch Petition to the King of England, looking for compromise on British acts and a decrease in tensions. However, the king rejected it. Early in 1776, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, which was a widely read pamphlet across all the colonies. Fighting had actually broken out well before the Declaration of Independence in some small-scale battles in Massachusetts. The British attempted to disarm Massachusetts militia. However, instead of disarmament, they found themselves in a series of small-scale pitched battles, including Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. We are looking at how much of a turning point was the Declaration of Independence. So we'll look at how much changed socially, politically, and economically with the signing of the Declaration of Independence as a fixed point in time. First, let's take a look at the economic realm. Before the Declaration of Independence, the American colonies were under the British mercantilist system. The preceding years had seen the British really clamp down on smuggling and restricting trade with only Great Britain. There had been a series of taxes the British government had tried out, from the Stamp Act to Sugar and Tea Acts. The people most affected by these restrictions and taxes were large plantation owners, as they could not seek the highest bidders for their cash crops, and merchants, especially in northeastern cities like Boston and New York. Most Americans were small-scale subsistence farmers, and these systems and taxes did not play a huge role in their lives. The immediate effect of the Declaration of Independence was a breakaway from the British mercantilist system. Now the trade restrictions are gone, and the taxes were gone. Looking further on, after the Declaration of Independence, the picture is a bit more muddled. Initially, there was economic turmoil, as the American currency was worthless. The U.S. owed a lot of money to foreign countries, and the government under the Articles had a hard time raising revenue through taxes. So the country's credit rating was terrible. For merchants, times were also difficult. While now they did not have to worry about the mercantilist system, they still had a hard time transporting and trading goods with European countries. Specifically, France and Great Britain had very little respect for American merchants and would regularly seize ships and impress sailors into their navies. This did not totally gum up trade, though, as the South now had a strong European market bidding for their cash crops. Once the Constitution was passed and Washington became the first president, a stronger central government meant more national coordination with the economy. Hamilton's economic program was enacted, which brought about controversial tariffs, a national bank, and imposed an excise tax on whiskey. All of these led to division within the U.S., but the economy began to stabilize and grow. Next, let's take a look at the social landscape. In this category, there are not a whole lot of changes. Before the Declaration of Independence, the social ladder looked like this. You had British officials on top, then colonial elites, which would include everyone from large plantation owners to wealthy merchants. Then the vast majority of Americans who are small-scale subsistence farmers. Looking at specific social groups, free men are clearly at the top, with free women having few rights at all below them, and slaves of any gender at the bottom. The immediate effect of the Declaration of Independence is throwing the British officials off the ladder. The colonial elites take their spot, but everyone else pretty much stays the same. Despite the Declaration of Independence having grand ideas about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and equality, that seemed to be meant for only a few, as it would take a long time for America to live up to those ideals. There were a few calls for equality from Abigail Adams, who wrote to founding father John Adams and asked him to remember the ladies when forming the government of this new country. But by and large, the ladies will be forgotten. And while some northern states do abolish slavery, it will actually expand in the following decades from the growth of cotton as a cash crop and new territories added into the Union. Plus, the system itself does not change a bit, as chattel slavery's brutality will remain. The political sphere is where we see the most change. Before the Declaration of Independence, the British government had severely constrained political freedoms, the best example being the Intolerable Acts. Decades prior, colonial legislatures had considerable autonomy under salutary neglect, but right before the Declaration, they had been limited to what they could do. Town meetings in New England were restricted, and colonists could be searched and belongings seized with no warrant. Finally, colonists saw less protections in trials as the British government's grip tightened. The immediate effect of the Declaration of Independence cannot be politically understated. It overhauled the political system. Now Americans had to set up their own government, and partially because of their previous experience under, in their view, British tyranny, colonial leaders set up a very weak central government called the Articles of Confederation. It was clear the state governments had most of the sovereignty, but this would also doom the Articles of Confederation to failure. A myriad of problems arose during the time of the Articles of Confederation, and it was decided that they needed to be thrown out in favor of a stronger, centralized government. The Constitution replaced the Articles in 1789, in which the central government gained power and sovereignty while the states lost it. 2 years later, the Bill of Rights were added to the Constitution, which enhanced individuals' freedoms and rights. On paper, anyways. Under the second president, John Adams, it was shown how these freedoms could be curtailed as his administration passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. But now it was the American federal government curtailing freedom, not the British. Today we are looking at the only governments the USA has had, the failed Articles of Confederation and our current government under the Constitution. This will just be a brief overview of the differences with some key details. It would be great to use in an APUSH essay about the topic. Okay, so let's get into the comparison. First, the central government in the Articles of Confederation was weak, and this is what led to its downfall, while the Constitution created a far stronger government than that of the Articles. Under the Articles, states had significant power, nearly as much as an independent country would, while the central government could barely do anything. Under the Constitution, there was a clear delegation of powers to both the federal government and state governments. While state governments have specific areas of control, like education, the federal government had sovereignty over the states. A brief comparison of the structure of both governments. The Articles really only had one branch, under which was a legislature, in which every state had a vote. It was difficult to get anything done because passing any bills required 2/3 of the states or more to agree, and pretty much impossible to make changes to the government, as that required a unanimous consent from all states. The government under the Constitution is much larger and more intricate. There are 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch is bicameral, meaning 2 houses. The first is the House of Representatives, which is based on population. States with larger populations have more seats. And the other is the Senate, in which every state is proportioned 2 senators. There are checks and balances to the power of the 3 branches, and I could go on for far longer. However, I'm going to keep this brief. Next, a major problem under the Articles of Confederation were taxation and monetary issues. The government could only request states pay taxes and had no other way to collect revenue. This sent the United States credit and monetary system into a tailspin, as the U.S. owed debts to foreign countries from the Revolutionary War, in which it could not pay them off. Under the Constitution, the government has much more ability to tax and also regulate trade. This is seen in the whiskey tax, which was implemented shortly after the Constitution took hold, and tariffs that were instituted under Hamilton's financial program in the 1790s. Also, the Constitution was more elastic because of the necessary and proper clause, allowing for the government to do things that were not specifically stated in it, like have a national bank. Although this would be very controversial, and I cover that topic with more depth in other videos. A few more comparisons to cover. First, as mentioned before, the government under the Articles had a hard time accomplishing anything, even the ability to put down small local rebellions, seen in the Shays Rebellion. There was no chance of other great powers ever taking the U.S. seriously. This changed under the Constitution. The government was able to legitimize its power when farmers in western Pennsylvania openly defied the whiskey tax and started a rebellion. Washington and his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who had a real interest in seeing the Constitution triumph, successfully put down the rebellion. Next, the Articles of Confederation had no Bill of Rights. It would not have been able to enforce them anyways. But the topic came up with the Constitution. Those who opposed the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists, demanded it be added as a protection against tyranny. Speaking of the Anti-Federalists, they had some well-known people in their camp that opposed the Constitution: Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, to name a couple of them. But the other side also boasted well-known figures, like James Madison, who wrote most of it, and Alexander Hamilton. It also had the tacit support of George Washington. So what was the deal with the Anti-Federalists? Well, they were worried that the Constitution, with its strong central government, would lead to tyranny, and it goes against the reasons for the Revolution. On the other side, the Federalists worried the country would be unmanageable under the Articles of Confederation, and thus the Constitution was necessary. And the first topic we will employ this skill on is U.S. government and politics from 1781 to 1820. Below you can see a graphic of the presidents from that time period, starting with Jorge Washington and ending with James Monroe. So let's dive deeper into this topic. Let's first start off with the big change that occurred during this time period, and that was the switch from the United States' first government, the Articles of Confederation, to its second and still going, Constitution. So here are the main changes that occurred. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was only one branch that was a single legislature, with every state, no matter how large or small, or size of their population, had one vote. It was very difficult to pass bills and laws, as they needed 2/3 vote, and to make any changes to the government needed unanimous consent, which was nearly impossible. Overall, the government under the Articles was very weak, and individual states had a considerable amount of sovereignty. That means to do what they please. Some of the major problems of the Articles were related to its weakness. The first major problem was its lack of ability to collect taxes. It could ask for taxes from the states, but could not compel them. This led to credit problems, as the U.S. owed other banks and foreign governments money from debts incurred during the Revolutionary War. Another example of its weakness was Shays Rebellion, which was also related to its tax and credit problems. This small rebellion of war veterans who were not properly compensated for their service began a rebellion in western Massachusetts. The government under the Articles was powerless to do anything about the rebellion. Eventually, it was put down by the state of Massachusetts itself. Overall, the Articles were very inflexible and could not meet the needs of a large nation. So the decision was made to scrap the Articles and write a new government. And the new government, mostly written by James Madison, was the Constitution. There had been about 2 years of debate about it between the Federalists, who wanted the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who were against it, but eventually it would pass. The Constitution had 3 branches, including a legislative branch with 2 houses, which are the House of Representatives, which has representation based on population of states, and the Senate, in which every state has 2 senators. Also, the executive branch with the president heading that branch, and the judicial branch with the Supreme Court and additional courts added by Congress later on. Compared to the Articles government, the Constitution was far stronger of a central government and was supreme over state governments. State governments still had special roles and powers, but it was clear sovereignty rested in the central government under the Constitution. There were and still are issues, though. A few of the bigger issues were the presence of slavery in the Constitution, and the powers of the judicial and executive branches were vague, leading to their roles changing over time. Now let's take a look at some of the political continuities over the time period. So this is what did not really change much at all. A central theme across the time period were arguments over how strong the central government should be. When the Constitution was drafted and being debated, 2 groups emerged in support and against it. The Federalists wanted a stronger federal government and made their arguments known in the Federalist Papers, 2 of which have core reasons, and they were Federalist Papers 10 and 51. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists, who argued that the Constitution and a strong federal government would lead to tyranny, and they often evoked the reasons for fighting the Revolutionary War a decade prior. After the Constitution was passed, these groups morphed into political parties. Now, there is not a direct line between them, as some members, principally the writer of the Constitution, James Madison, went from a Federalist to a Jeffersonian Republican, but the core arguments remained the same. The Federalist political party would be active for the remainder of this time period, and some of the early key leaders were John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They favored tariffs, which are taxes on imports, a national bank, a close relationship with Great Britain, and were against the War of 1812. On the other side were the Jeffersonian Republicans, also known as the Democratic Republicans, with key leaders being Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They favored an agrarian democracy, close relationship with France, and were for the War of 1812. Some other big government and political changes over the time period was the addition of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. This was done to placate the Anti-Federalists, who demanded rights be guaranteed by the government. Another development was the Marbury v. Madison case. Up to this point, the Supreme Court did not have a clear mandate on its role. The Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review as a result of this case. This is an incredibly important power, as the Supreme Court can declare a law or executive action unconstitutional. A third major change was the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson was able to win control of the executive branch from the unpopular John Adams. While it was not the end of the Federalist Party, it did signal their long decline. And finally, the years after the War of 1812 are known as the Era of Good Feelings, a time in which there was a sense of national purpose and desire for unity among Americans. This won't last long, though. Finally, let's take a look at some key policy changes over the time period. The Washington-Adams era saw a somewhat pro-Great Britain stance, although Washington was most concerned with preserving neutrality in foreign affairs. To support this, there are pieces of evidence, including Jay's Treaty, which was an agreement with Great Britain in regards to several continuing disputes, and during the Adams administration, the U.S. engaged in an undeclared or quasi-war with France, which was, of course, Great Britain's arch-rival. Specifically, during the Adams administration, there was a hindering of rights, as he signed into law the Alien Sedition Acts, and in general, the administration was more loose in its interpretation of the Constitution. They also employed Hamilton's economic program, which brought about high tariffs, a national bank, and support of manufacturing. When Jefferson swept into power in the election of 1800, there was a major shift in policy. Jefferson was pro-France, although he tried mightily to remain neutral in foreign affairs, going so far as to limit shipping and trade with foreign nations under the Embargo and Non-Intercourse Acts. Jefferson, in particular, tried to strictly follow the Constitution. He reduced the size of government, favored lower tariffs, and states' rights. And he was even iffy on completing the amazing deal for the U.S., the Louisiana Purchase, because he thought the Constitution did not give him any right to. but thankfully, he did anyway. Hello, welcome to AP Sources Simplified. This is going to be a quick review today on the first two political parties in our nation's history, the Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. These parties formed during the presidency of George Washington, were actively worried about the splintering of the country into factions. However, as you will see, these two groups had some major differences in ideology and direction the country should take. Okay, let's jump into it. To start, let's examine their views on the role of government in general. The Hamiltonian Federalists believed in the necessity of a strong central government, more akin to the British, while the Jeffersonian Republicans, always concerned about tyranny, emphasized states' rights and a limited central government. Diving down a little deeper into their thoughts on government, the Hamiltonians felt the Constitution should be interpreted loosely and felt the elastic clause allowed the government to do things outside of what is written in the Constitution. On the other hand, the Jeffersonian Republicans believed in the strict interpretation of the Constitution, so government should only be able to do what is allowed for in the words of the Constitution. For example, they opposed the creation of a national bank because the Constitution makes no mention of a national bank. Next is their difference on the direction the economy should take. Hamiltonians felt that the U.S. should go the route of the British and emphasize commerce and manufacturing, while the Jeffersonians preferred an agricultural-based economy. Jefferson called it a yeoman-farmer republic. In foreign policy, they could not be more different as well, and tensions will be really high between the two camps on this topic. The Hamiltons favored the British as a source of stability and because of a common heritage, despite the ill will over the recent Revolutionary War, while the Jeffersonians favored the French, signaling both France's support of the American Revolution, and they felt the French Revolution was an extension of the American Revolution. The Republicans were outraged when the U.S. got into an undeclared quasi-war with France during the Adams administration. Lastly, the Hamiltonians emphasized the government playing a strong role in creating order and stability, while the Jeffersonians were always wary of a strong government, and they stressed protection of civil liberties and trust in the people. In this video, we're going to put John Adams' turbulent presidency into context by taking a look at the situation John Adams was stepping into and some of the controversies of his presidency. After the ratification of the Constitution, George Washington won the first election for the presidency, and it was never in doubt he would become the first president. Washington, at the beginning of his presidency, was universally admired in the young republic. However, several difficult issues sprung up during his tenure that would have great influence on the difficulties in the John Adams presidency. One of the major issues was disagreements about what direction the country should take. On one side was Jefferson, who envisioned a yeoman-farmer republic with a decentralized federal government. He also wanted the U.S. to ally with France in their revolution, believing it was an extension of the American Revolution. Plus, France was such a great ally to the U.S. during our own revolution. On the other side was Alexander Hamilton, who envisioned a merchant and industrialized economy, with a strong centralized government. He wanted to more closely ally with Great Britain. While these two were competing for influence with Washington, John Adams was sidelined in the vice presidency role. These two competing ideologies ended up being the foundation of the first two national political parties, the Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. Meanwhile, there were continuing issues with Great Britain, including the British not vacating forts in the Northwest Territories and harassing American merchants in a variety of ways. Washington sent John Jay to negotiate with the British, resulting in a treaty. Many back in the U.S. thought that the deal was a bad one for America. However, Washington was eager to avoid conflict. There were also problems with the French. As their revolution became more fanatical, they began to attempt to export it to other countries, including the U.S. The French sent over a diplomat named Citizen Genet, who caused trouble for Washington as he stirred up radical elements of the American populace. Washington was able to maintain American neutrality despite great pressure from various factions to more closely align the U.S. with either Great Britain or France. Washington also worried tremendously about the growing political parties and partisanism. These were central themes in his farewell address as he left office. However, both the international issues and partisanism were not solved under Washington, and they would fall to the next president, John Adams, who will have an extremely difficult time dealing with those issues. So the largest issue that Adams dealt with was the international problems, namely France. It also exacerbated the political divisions within his own Federalist camp and with the opposition Jeffersonian Republicans. As mentioned before, the French Revolution had become more extreme, and France was acting more aggressive. They had started seizing American merchant ships, impressing sailors, and taking cargo. America sent diplomats to try to smooth the situation over. However, they were not afforded a normal diplomatic response, and instead were met by French bureaucratic middlemen who demanded a bribe, and the U.S. provide financial assistance to the French government. This was made public back in the US, and there was outrage amongst anti-French politicians, mostly in the Federalist camp. An undeclared naval war ensued with the French, now called the Quasi-War. However, it was not universally popular back in the US, as Jeffersonian Republicans hated the idea of war and bad relations with the French. Former President Washington urged Adams to appoint Hamilton as Major General, who began to make preparations for a large-scale war against the French. However, despite being in the same political camp, Adams and Hamilton did not get along at all. Hamilton thought little of Adams, and Adams thought Hamilton was too much of a political schemer and too eager for war with a powerful European nation. Within Adams' own camp were individuals more loyal to Hamilton than he, including the treasurer. They went behind Adams' back to support Hamilton's preparation for war. Eventually, Adams was able to reach a peace agreement with France, and shortly thereafter, he fired Hamilton's supporters. While Adams was losing influence in his own party, the opposition hated him even more. Elections were different in this time period as the runner-up became vice president, and so Adams' vice president was Thomas Jefferson. Those two men had been great friends during the Revolution, but now were bitterly divided, and soon into Adams' presidency, they were no longer on speaking terms. The pressure of his political enemies drove Adams and the Federalist Congress to pass the very controversial Alien and Sedition Acts. First, the Alien Act made it more difficult for immigrants to gain citizenship. The reason for it was that radical French immigrants would attempt to subvert the government with radical candidates for office. The act hurt the Jeffersonian Republicans as immigrants were a major base of support. The Sedition Act prohibited vocal and printed opposition to the government. This act took away First Amendment rights and was exactly what Jefferson had warned against ever since the Articles of Confederation were thrown out in favor of a strong centralized government in the Constitution. Some states even openly defied the federal law. Virginia and Kentucky passed resolutions declaring the law invalid as it went against constitutional rights. By the end of his presidency, John Adams was deeply unpopular and would go on to lose to Thomas Jefferson in the pivotal election of 1800. We are looking at the continuities and changes over time of the American economy from 1800 to 1848. This coincides with period 4 of APUSH, and a huge focus of that time period were the changes to the American economy. We're going to devote more time to the changes, but let's first take a look at what stayed the same. The biggest continuity of the time period was that most Americans were small-scale farmers throughout the time period. We will not see the major shift to cities and factory work until the late 1800s. So while we talk a lot about the changes, keep in mind for most families and Americans, it was business as usual, aside from possibly some new farm tools that we will get into later. In the South, the plantation aristocracy maintained its hold on the best land and owned most of the slaves before and during the explosion of cotton plantations. This is while the poor whites struggled to get by farming on marginal land. In the Northeast, shipping and banking continued to be major industries, and most immigrants settled there in cities or the countryside. Okay, now let's get into all the changes. First, let's go over the influential Clay's American system. Henry Clay, a famous politician from Kentucky who held a lot of sway in Congress. His idea was to interconnect the region's economies and make them dependent on each other. The West could feed the country with wheat, corn, and beef. The South could supply the cotton for northern manufacturers who make products the rest of the country could buy. Another key aspect was building the infrastructure to make this possible. To do this, the government would need revenue, so Clay proposed high tariffs to both protect American manufacturers and raise revenue for infrastructure projects. He also supported a national bank that could provide loans to states and corporations to build canals, roads, and railroads. The bank and tariffs were incredibly controversial, which led to many political battles, but I will cover that in a different video about the Whigs and Jacksonian Democrats. Canals and steamships decreased travel times between connected cities, the most famous example being the Erie Canal. This era also saw the development of railroads and the telegraph. While extremely costly, railroads offered the most promise when it came to mass transport of people and goods. Telegraph lines were built alongside railroads and across major cities, and there were plans for laying them across oceans to interconnect continents, which would happen in the next time period. Telegraph allowed for instant communication and was key to business. Now let's look at the development of the cotton and slave economy of the South. The cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney in 1793. It made cotton profitable as the machine could efficiently separate the seed from the boil. The Deep South had a good climate and soil for cotton fields. What was needed were hands to pick the cotton, which leads us to the interconnected topic of slavery. Before the cotton gin, there were theories that slavery would die out on its own, as it was not seen as profitable or humane. Many northern states abolished it in the late 1700s. However, the cotton gin changed the direction of slavery from decline to growth. In 1800, there were about 1 million slaves, and by 1860, there were 4 million. As you probably already know, the growth of slavery and Southern dependence on it will lead to tensions between the North and South. Overall, cotton would be known as King Cotton and dominated the South socially, politically, and economically. Let's take a quick look at a few other changes that impacted the economy. Factory systems in the North sprung up by nearby rivers. They utilized the current of a river with water wheels to power new machines like power looms and spinning jennies that churned out yarn and clothing. These factories typically employed young women, which gave them some opportunity. The Lowell factory system is the most famous. The last development we will look at is the reaper and plow. Both of these quickly became key farm equipment, especially in the West where the sod was thick. These tools help farmers produce greater crop yields per acre. Today we are putting into context and reviewing the Second Great Awakening, which runs roughly from 1790 to 1840. This will not be a deep dive into the Second Great Awakening itself, but more we will look at what forces influenced the beginning of it and what type of effect it had on society. First, let's take a look at the United States leading into the Second Great Awakening. America in the 1790s was now under a new government, the recently ratified Constitution. During this decade, the first president was elected, George Washington, and the second president, John Adams, had a turbulent time in office. Along with this turbulence came the formation of the first political parties, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The French Revolution was raging in Europe, and it affected society and politics in the U.S. as revolutionary ideas spread to the U.S. Domestically, we need to cover the status of women, as they will be major players in the Second Great Awakening. Females had very few political rights and were expected to play a subservient role to men in what was very much a patriarchy. Women were expected to stay in their social sphere, which included the cult of domesticity, in which a woman should focus on home life, raising her children, be pious, and obey her husband. A slightly elevated thought was that of Republican motherhood, in which a woman has the important role of educating her sons to be intelligent and involved citizens in the new republic. So there are some big questions we need to ask. Would the American Revolution, the new Constitution, and Bill of Rights affect gender roles and religion? Would revolutionary ideas also spread to the family and Christianity? I do not usually like to quote straight from the College Board curriculum, but I think in this case, it gives a nice starting point with our analysis of the Second Great Awakening. The curriculum says, quote, "The rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs, a response to rationalism, and changes to society caused by the market revolution, along with a greater social and geographical mobility, contributed to the Second Great Awakening among Protestants that influenced moral and social reforms and inspired utopian and other religious movements." So they give both in that long sentence there the causes of the Second Great Awakening and also some of its effects. But now we need to provide some specific evidence for that content standard. Unlike Puritan beliefs, which emphasized predestination, the focus of the Second Great Awakening was on the second coming of Christ. So if Jesus is coming back, humans need to tidy up the place a bit by reforming society. The biggest impact of the movement is among women. Evangelical missions gave women more status, which also gave them more purpose. The awakening was most active in upstate New York, which was called the Burned Over District because of all the fire and brimstone preachers and revivals. But the meetings stretched across the country, and they were very popular on the frontier. Charles Finney became the most well-known preacher of the time. New religious groups and utopian societies formed. Some great examples are the Shakers and Mormons. Finally, let's look at some of the big impacts of the Second Great Awakening. Its powerful idea of perfecting society leads to broader movements, including the abolition of slavery, temperance movement, women's rights and suffrage movement, transcendentalism, and many more like education and prison reform. Women played a prominent role in all of these movements, with some notable names like Susan B. Anthony, the Grimke sisters, Sojourner Truth, and Margaret Fuller. The Second Great Awakening also fits nicely with the era of the common man, as voting rights for non-property owning white men were expanded. This is also known as the Jacksonian era. The expansion of these political rights in the Second Great Awakening had the great impact of increasing involvement in politics and society overall. And today we are looking at Manifest Destiny, and basically breaking it into two eras, before the Transcontinental Railroad and after the Transcontinental Railroad. Below the text, you see a picture taken at Promontory Point in Utah. That is where the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads finally met and completed the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, let's get into it. First, what was going on before the Transcontinental Railroad? There were numerous land acquisitions during the early to mid 1800s. Here are just a few of the major ones, including the Louisiana Purchase, which secured the Great Plains from the French. Then we have the annexation of Texas, which has a whole fascinating history behind it, but we're just going to leave it at that for now. Then the US and Mexico got into a war, partly because of a disagreement about the southern border of Texas. The US was the victor and forced the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which secured the US almost all of California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Also, there was the Oregon Treaty, made with Great Britain, that smoothed out the northern border and included Idaho, Oregon, and Washington state. So how did the settlers get out to these purchased and conquered lands? They had two options, both of which were very dangerous. First was the wagon trails. The most famous trails being the Santa Fe, which connected the overland trade to native tribes in the southern plains and Mexico. Then there was the Mormon Trail, which members of a new utopian society, the Mormons, took to escape persecution and to find a place to build their own utopia. And finally, and most famously, the Oregon Trail, to which settlers looking to find great farming land, fur trade, or mine for precious metals took to get out to the West Coast. These overland routes had to contend with rough terrain, hostile Native Americans, and freezing cold or terribly hot weather. The other option was a boat journey around the tip of South America because there was no Panama Canal yet. This trip had to pass through the Straits of Magellan, which usually had very rough seas. One of the biggest draws for migration to the West was the California gold rush. This drew in immigrants from Asia, especially China, and gold seekers from all over, and led to the rapid statehood of California shortly after the Mexican-American War. Side note, the Chinese immigrants were met with a lot of derision and racism, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Next, let's look at the immediate impact of the Transcontinental Railroad. First, it makes the journey to the West much easier. The travel time goes down to days or weeks instead of months, and gets rid of many of the dangers of travel. It also opens up the Great Plains for farming and ranching. Depots along the route allow for farmers and ranchers to be able to transport their produce to eastern markets efficiently. The railroad is also an immediate threat to Native Americans in the region. Before the railroad, there was some conflict, but natives and settlers could and would avoid each other. But now there is a rush of settlers taking advantage of the Homestead Act, in which they could receive 160 free acres of land if they developed it. The migration to the Plains and Rockies would spell the ultimate doom for Native Americans living freely. Finally, the long-term impact. Continuing on with Native Americans, the 1860s through 1880s would see the final and brutal Native American wars. Tribes like the Comanche and Sioux tried to hold out as long as possible, but even those great warrior cultures would be forced onto reservations when their primary food source was destroyed as hunters, utilizing the railroad, slaughtered millions of buffalo and sent their hides back east. Then, after being forced on reservations that were typically on marginal or worthless land, the American government instituted the Dawes Act in an attempt to assimilate Native Americans. They tried to turn Native Americans into farmers with property, but many Plains Indians did not want or know how to farm. They would end up getting swindled out of a lot of their land for cheap prices by Eastern speculators. Along with the loss of land, many Native children were taken to boarding schools in the East as the government tried to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. Even in the time period, some Americans felt that the natives had been mistreated. Helen Hunt Jackson documented it in her book, A Century of Dishonor. In other major noteworthy long-term impacts, the era of the open range came to an abrupt end as the simple innovation of barbed wire made it possible for ranchers to close off large areas of land, ending the days of freely roaming cowboys. Back across the Mississippi, the well-located Midwestern city Chicago benefited greatly as a railroad hub between West and East. The city would boom and be a center of the meatpacking industry. In the 1890s, the U.S. government declared the frontier officially closed, and there was no more unconquered land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a famous essay arguing that the frontier played a central importance to the development of the country, and he worried about the direction the country would take now that the frontier was gone. But America would keep expanding. As the next era saw American imperialism overseas, as it rushed to keep up with its European rivals with their great colonial empires. So today we're going to take a look at the Civil War and the causes of it. So the first thing we want to look at, and this is kind of the base of the causes of the Civil War, is the slavery-based economy, the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. So the slave-based economy goes back to the beginning of the colonies. The South depended upon it at first for its cash crop of tobacco, and then later on for cotton. And the North profited off of it in a variety of ways, via money lenders to those large plantations, the shipping that the cotton and tobacco provided, and the manufacturers later on, when we go through the market revolution, will be able to turn that cotton into clothes. In the Declaration of Independence, you have high-minded ideals of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and equality. And those were definitely at odds with slavery. So it was kind of hard to square that circle there with how do you, as a founding of this country, have those ideals, but at the same time have this brutal system of slavery. And then we get the Constitution. And in the Constitution, there's a couple of spots. While it doesn't specifically say slaves, they usually have other words for it, like indentured servants or labor. The meaning is slavery. So the first one is the 3/5 compromise, which the South wanted because they wanted to be able to count their slaves in order to have a higher population amount, which would give them greater representation in the House of Representatives. So they said every slave is worth 3/5 of a person. And there also is in the Constitution a fugitive slave clause, basically saying that, slaves that escape need to be brought back. Now, again, they don't actually say slave, they say person held to service or labor, but it means slave. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is the slave trade and the 1820 Missouri Compromise. The 1808 international slave trade was banned, and the South actually agreed with it. Now, the thing was, though, is the domestic slave trade was thriving, especially since the invention of the cotton gin in the late 1700s. There was a thought that slavery might die out. In the North, many states in the 1780s and 1790s had actually banned slavery, partly because it was just not a viable means of an economic system in that part. And in the South, they thought the same thing might happen until the cotton gin came around, and it made the production of cotton much more viable. And what they needed for the cotton gin was people to pick the cotton, because then they'd bring it to the gin, and the gin would be able to separate the cotton seed from the cotton boil quickly. But you needed a lot of hands out there to pick the actual cotton. And then we have the 1820 Missouri Compromise. The United States had gained some territory in the Louisiana Purchase, and now as that territory became settled, some of these territories started to apply for statehood. And we had a question about, well, these new territories, what are we going to do with them? Are they going to be slave or free? And this will be a continuing question now all the way up to the Civil War. Every time that a territory is about to become a state, Congress has to deal with this question. So this is the first of several compromises. And one thing they've tried to do is try to keep a balance in Congress. So they're going to allow for Missouri right here to come in as a slave state. Maine up here will come in as a free state. And they set this line that's supposed to answer this question once and for all, but of course it won't. And it's the 3630 parallel, or the southern border of most of Missouri. And they say basically anything below this line will be, any territories become states will become slave. Anything above this line will be free states. They think they have it solved, but it won't be. Now, there are other issues. Slavery is the main cause, but there are some other issues that play a part of this as well. One of the big ones is tariffs. Tariffs are always contentious. They're contentious all the way up until the early 1900s. The more agricultural South did not like them because foreign countries, if we put a tax on their goods and they put a tax on our biggest export, and our biggest export by far was cotton. And so the South did not like tariffs because then other countries would put a tax on their cotton and make it less competitive with other countries' cotton. The North was trying to build a manufacturing base. It needed tariffs to protect industries from competition with foreign manufacturers, mostly Great Britain. We were several decades behind Great Britain in the Industrial Revolution. Their goods were cheaper. In order to try to allow for our industry to be able to go and grow, they needed to tax British goods to make American goods competitive with it. Now let's take a look at the 1828 and 1832 tariffs. These tariffs, one of which was called the Tariff of Abominations, they led to some serious disagreements between specifically South Carolina and the federal government. South Carolina threatened nullification, meaning it wasn't going to follow the rules, this federal law. And nullification was a powerful idea. It came from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions several decades prior in the John Adams administration. And the idea was that state governments should be able to nullify a federal law it deemed that it was outside of its constitutional bounds, that it was a bad law or tyrannical or whatever. The thing was, though, is nullification had no actual legal standing. It was just a powerful idea. And at the time, President Jackson was not a president to mess with. He got Congress to pass a Force Act, and he threatened to send the military to South Carolina in order to enforce this law and to put down any kind of, growing South Carolinian dissension. And South Carolina is going to back down. However, this kind of fuels this ongoing debate about the future of the country. Should it be an agricultural-based country and allow for slavery to continue? Or should it develop a manufacturing base with wage labor, or as they called, free labor? So some more events and compromises. Another big one was a compromise of 1850. After the Mexican-American War, the United States had acquired a lot more territory, all of the Southwest. And California, because of a gold rush, was rapidly, its population was rapidly increasing and was able to apply for statehood. So California enters part of the compromise as a free state. However, there's this key term here that should be in any kind of essay on the cause of the Civil War, and that is popular sovereignty. So this is this idea promoted at the time by Stephen Douglas, that future states should just be allowed to vote on whether to have slavery or not. Forget about any kind of compromise lines or any of those things. Just let's allow the territories to vote. And this opens the door for the Missouri Compromise to be nullified, because now they're saying, well, if you have a new territory and it's north of that Missouri Compromise line and they vote yes for slavery, I guess that old compromise is now thrown out. And also a part of this, for California entering as a free state, there's a very harsh new Fugitive Slave Act. Now, there were a couple of Fugitive Slave Acts that were already on the books, but this one really kind of threatened the sovereignty of northern states. It made it possible for someone who was helping a slave in the North, they could face some criminal issues as well for themselves. And it kind of made everyone in the North, made a lot of people in the North feel like they are now a part of this part of the slave system. And a lot of them didn't like that. There's also, from the 1820s onward, a growing abolitionist movement. Now, there are several key players in this, but if you're going to write an essay on it, one of the biggest ones, you should know and put in there is Frederick Douglass and his abolitionist magazine, The North Star. Another big event, or actually this is more of a book, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And if you live in the North, slavery is something that's really far away, so you probably don't ever even think about it. However, the literacy rate in the North is very high, and this was an incredibly popular book and widely read, and it really brought the depictions of the realities of slavery to the people in the North. They could, read and somewhat understand like how terrible the institution was. And then we have Bleeding Kansas. So Kansas was a state that was north of that Missouri Compromise line, and they were going to vote on slavery. Now, the people in the North felt this vote should never even happen because of the Missouri Compromise and that this should be a free state. So what happens is pro and anti-slave forces from across the United States flood into Bleeding Kansas, and you get some violence breaking out and even some small-scale battles. Then we get Dred Scott and John Brown. Dred Scott, who I made a video upon earlier, you should check it out. It goes in depth about this fascinating case, considered the worst Supreme Court decision of all time. Dred Scott, who was a slave who had been taken into free territories, and then in his master's will had said he should be set free, he had a great case for his freedom and his family's freedom. And throughout several years, he goes through the court process, and eventually he gets to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that Dred Scott has no legal standing, that the case shouldn't even be brought there because he's a slave. And also, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Taney goes a step further and throws out the Missouri Compromise. And depending on how you read the decision, this looks like it opens up slavery to all of the territories and possibly even the states as well. And this enrages the North, especially abolitionists. Then we get John Brown. John Brown was actually a part of Bleeding Kansas. He had gone there as an anti-slavery person and had taken part in some of those violent actions that are there. Then later on, he organizes with some of his family and former slaves. He organizes a raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, Harper's Ferry is a military weapons depot, and he was trying to get a hold of a bunch of weapons to then go and start a slave uprising in the South. His plan goes awry, though. Shortly after taking Harper's Ferry, the military closes around him and arrests him. And while he's on trial, he gives all these speeches and everything, and they're published in the newspapers. And he's a hero in the North, but a total villain in the South. Then we get to finally the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, the Republican Party was a fairly new party. It had only run in one major election before. It was made up of former Whigs, abolitionists, the Free Soilers who wanted to have land in the territories both free from slavery, but also free or nearly free for settlers. And this was a very, very powerful faction in that party, which Lincoln was a part of. Now, Lincoln had promised the South he would not ban slavery in the South. He did want to see the territories be with no slavery, but he tried to assure the South he was not going to ban slavery there. However, there's so many conspiracies in the South that Lincoln was going to take away slavery and take away their slaves. And even some of the conspiracies said that he was going to make white people in the South into slaves. There was a lot of mistrust going on with Lincoln. So he was not even on the ballot in southern states. And we can see here, Lincoln did not take any southern states. We have some of these border states right here going to the Constitutional Union Party with Bell. But then Lincoln swept the North and California and Oregon. And that gave him enough electoral votes because most of the population at this time period is in the North. They have much higher population than the South. Popular vote was more close. Lincoln did not get even half the popular vote. And now in this time period, there was a long time after you were elected before you actually took power. And so in this time period from November to, I can't remember, it was either March or April until Lincoln was going to take power, the South was breaking away. And there's a last-ditch attempt called the Crittenden Compromise in the Senate to try and resolve the differences, and that fails. And the president, who's a lame duck president, President Buchanan, also considered one of the worst presidents of all time, he really does nothing while the South breaks away during his lame duck session and before Lincoln can take power. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more AP review materials for this year's AP test, and also I make the primary source explanation videos as well, subscribe to the channel. Today we are preparing for the AP exam with looking at what caused the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era ran roughly from 1900 to 1920, was an era of government reform and action. So in order to answer this question, we need to look at the previous era because the Progressive Era was a reaction to the previous era. And what was that era? It is called the Gilded Age, which ran roughly from 1870 to 1900. And I just want to make a quick mention of the incredibly popular and common political cartoon seen here on the slide. It describes the Gilded Age well. It is called Bosses of the Senate, which I made a short video about, so go check that out for a more in-depth analysis. But it's basically depicting how private corporations have control over government, and the people are locked out. So the first thing we need to talk about with the Gilded Age is the great economic growth of that era. Earlier in the 1800s, and for APUSH period 4, there was the market revolution, which was small-scale factory systems springing up in the Northeast. And then during the Civil War, the U.S. government had great demand and contracts for armaments and supplies, which helped fuel larger-scale mass production. After the Civil War is the Gilded Age, also known as the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. It saw the growth of mega factories. Some great examples of these, which would also be great evidence on a DBQ about this topic, were the meatpacking industry in Chicago, steel industry around Pittsburgh, and the entire railroad industry. The Industrial Revolution in the U.S. leads to soaring corporate profits, but also great income inequality between the wealthy and everyone else. Some great examples of the wealthy elite include Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, and J. Vanderbilt. While a few amassed great fortunes, many of their workers lived in squalor. Wages were kept low as competition in the era is often described as cutthroat. John Rockefeller would go so far as to sell his products at a loss to undercut his competitors and drive them out of business. This cutthroat competition, along with vertical and horizontal integration, leads to a few companies dominating entire economic sectors. Some great examples are Rockefeller with Standard Oil and Carnegie with U.S. Steel. However, workers became agitated and attempted to form unions and collectively bargain. The owners and management typically refused to bargain with unions, and this led to significant management and worker strife. Many times, workers' attempts to unionize were met with hostility, and those who attempted to unionize were fired. Owners would go so far as to hire spies and place them amongst the workers. Some unions were successful in organizing, and a few of the major unions and their leaders included the Knights of Labor. However, after boasting of hundreds of thousands of members, they would have a rapid downfall after the Haymarket Affair. The more moderate AFL, which is still around today, was led by the famous Samuel Gompers, and Eugene V. Debs, later multi-time socialist candidate for president, was a leader of many union strikes, including the famous 1877 railroad strike and 1893 Pullman strike. Speaking of famous strikes, those two I just mentioned, along with the famous Homestead strike at the Carnegie Steel Mill, which ended in violence as the Pinkertons, a private for-hire police force, attempted to break up the strike. Eventually, the National Guard had to come in to quell the violence and the strike, of which in the Gilded Age era, the government typically sided with the companies over the workers. This will change in the Progressive era. However, during the Gilded Age, the National Guard was called on multiple times to break strikes. Another hallmark of this era was government corruption at all levels. Local governments and cities were dominated by political machines. They got their hands on the tax revenue and were able to fill their and their supporters' pockets. The best example of this is Tammany Hall in New York. State governments were also dominated by political machines. Any type of reform legislation was typically blocked by representatives that were supported by political machines, and senators were not popularly elected, and many times are appointed through corrupt political machines. On the national level, several administrations in the era had trouble with scandals, no more so than the Grant administration. There were so many scandals with so many officials, it would take a while to name them all. But a few of the most well-known were the Gold Ring, Whiskey Ring, and Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was constantly selling goods that were meant for Native Americans as part of treaties. The problem was many officials were unqualified or inept as they got their jobs through the old spoils system. There was an attempt in the era with the Pendleton Service Act to have standards for jobs and find qualified government officials. There was also an attempt to rein in the power of monopolies, also called trusts, with the Sherman Antitrust Act. But ironically, in this era, it was used on unions to try to break them up, as they were deemed anti-capitalist with collective bargaining. There were calls for reform in the era, the loudest coming from the Populist Party, which was a powerful third party based in the agricultural plains, South, and Midwest. Some of their positions included government regulation of railroads, direct election of senators, bimetallism, which is a complex topic I cover in another video I made about William Jennings Bryan Cross of Gold speech, and finally an income tax to both reduce income inequality and get rid of tariffs as a means of government revenue. The Populists would fail to win a presidential election or a majority of seats in either house of Congress, but their positions would be picked up by progressives in both parties in the next era. In the late 1800s, influential social gospel and progressive reformers began to appear from the middle and upper classes and press for action. A couple of great examples of this is Jane Addams and the Hull House program intended to help poor immigrants, and Jacob Riis, who created a photographic presentation entitled How the Other Half Lives that showcases the terrible conditions of inner city slums. It was widely published, and Riis gave presentations and talks to the wealthy, pressing them for action. We should look at some of the effects the Gilded Age problems had on the Progressive era. So let's just briefly look at how the Progressive era tried to clean up the issues from the Gilded Age. First off, the era saw 3 presidents that changed the presidency forever, as they were far more active and saw the presidency as a position meant to directly impact and help the people. These 3 were Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. They would set out to regulate business and break up trusts. A few of their major achievements include the Meat Inspection Act, creation of the FDA, the breakup of Standard Oil, the regulation of railroads, and changing the formerly hostile relationship between government and workers by calling for agreements between labor and management. At the state level, reforms of referendum, initiative, and recall were adopted in many states, and at the local level, cities began to appoint city managers who were generally engineers and technocrats. They gave them the power to clean up the slums, create building codes, and a variety of other actions to scientifically manage a city. There were also several new amendments passed in the era, including an income tax amendment, the direct election of senators, prohibition, and the women's right to vote, which capped off the Progressive era. I do have another video in which I go in depth about these progressive amendments if you want more detail. Today, we are looking at the continuities and changes over time of the social position of African Americans from 1865 to 1900. This time period coincides with both Reconstruction in the first part and the beginning of segregation in the second part. The famous image below helps describe the first part of this era. It shows a Freedmen's Bureau agent from the federal government holding back an angry white mob. Sadly, this federal intervention and protection would not last long. First, let's take a look at the legal changes that occurred during the time period. Shortly after the Civil War, the newly freed slaves had to deal with black codes that the white, now former Confederates, passed in many towns and counties across the South. These codes severely restricted African Americans in every aspect of life. However, when radical Republicans in Congress took control of Reconstruction, further boosted by the electoral victory of former General Ulysses S. Grant in 1868, the federal government became way more involved in guaranteeing rights of African Americans. They enforced the 13th Amendment as black codes were done away with, passed new amendments, including the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing rights and citizenship to former slaves, and passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. However, as a side note, not gender, which angered women's suffrage supporters. But the Supreme Court would deal a series of legal blows to equality for African Americans in two specific cases. The first is what was referred to as the slaughterhouse cases, in which the ruling narrowed the rights of African Americans and said the 13th and 14th Amendments did not apply in economic situations. The next case is the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson, which cemented Southern laws segregating the races. If you'd like more detail about this landmark case, I made a short video about it and you can find it on this YouTube page. Now, taking a look at some more changes that impacted African Americans, there were some attempts by the federal government, specifically radical Republicans and the Grant administration, to help African Americans in the South. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, which is one of the first instances of direct aid from the federal government to large swaths of citizens. The Freedmen's Bureau helped find family members that were sold away during slavery, also legalized marriages that occurred on slave plantations, and helped educate the newly freedmen. There also were attempts at helping African Americans start businesses and banking through the Freedmen's Savings Bank, although, like a lot of departments in the Grant administration, it was hopelessly corrupt. Then a big change happened with the Compromise of 1877. The election of 1876 was really close and produced no clear electoral winner, so it went to the House of Representatives. A bargain was struck between Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans that they would give the election to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in return for an end of Reconstruction and federal occupation of the South. The Republicans agreed, and that spelled the end of Reconstruction, along with the previously mentioned Supreme Court decision spelled doom for African Americans, as they would then be completely shut out of political power and regulated to the bottom of the social ladder. Another continuity was the racial violence and terrorism against African Americans. Freed slaves were met with hostility from Southern whites throughout the time period. The Ku Klux Klan and the Redeemers were a couple of groups that terrorized African Americans. There were two instances in particular that stand out. One was the New Orleans Massacre of 1866, and the other was the Memphis Riots of 1866. These two instances showcase horrific violence against the newly freedmen, as hundreds were killed. This was also was beginning of the Jim Crow, or segregation, and many lynchings would begin in this era and occur over the next several decades. The South will have de jure, meaning segregation by law, and the North will have de facto, meaning segregation by custom. And segregation will last until the second half of the 20th century. The last continuity I want to discuss is the continued subordinate economic position of African Americans. We started the era with the end of slavery, and while what replaced was not technically slavery, it kept African Americans from the ability to ever rise up the social and economic ladder, and that system was sharecropping. It involved the sharecropper receiving land and seed that would typically be an African American, although some poor whites were also involved in this system. And in exchange for the land and seed, he promised to give the landowner half of the crop once it was ready to be picked. The sharecropper buys food and clothing at a credit from the landowner's store, and then the sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. The sharecropper then gives the landowner crop to sell, and the sharecropper gets half the earnings, minus his debt for the year. When settling up, the landowner says the sharecropper owes more than he has earned. To pay the debt, the sharecropper has to promise the landowner a greater share of his next year's crop. By the time the sharecropper had shared their crops and paid their debts, they rarely had any money left. The sharecropper became tied to one plantation, having to work until his debts were paid, and they were never paid. Today we're looking at a topic that has been very popular on college board tests for the last 5 or 6 years, and that is the social and political position of women. Specifically, we are going to be looking at what is called the first wave of feminism from 1890 to 1920. We will also look a bit before and after those dates to evaluate the context and effects. All right, let's get started. First, some context, and this also serves as continuity as well, as the ideas of the traditional roles for females are never really overhauled in this era. The idea of Republican motherhood goes back to the days after the Revolution. It is the idea that women do need some education for the primary reason of educating their sons to be good and informed democratic citizens. The dominant ideas of women's roles throughout society are separate spheres and cult of domesticity, which go together. First, separate spheres is the idea that there is a sphere for men, which is politics, the tavern, working outside the home, and higher education, and a sphere for women, which is staying at home, cooking, spinning clothes, cleaning, and taking care of the kids. Along with this is the cult of domesticity, which says that women should be pious, pure, submissive, and a good housewife. These ideas, while challenged in our era of focus, still dominate the ethos throughout. We need to set the scene a little more and discuss a few other aspects of women in society before 1890. Women had few opportunities. They were paid less than men. Management of companies was almost always male. Women had no political rights. If married, no property rights. The fight for political rights was seen as the first instrumental step for equality. A fringe movement of women fighting for suffrage sprung up in the mid-1800s, with several conventions to discuss the issue. The most famous convention being Seneca Falls, in which the attendees produced the famous document, the Declaration of Sentiments. If you'd like to know more information about that key primary source, I made a video on it that I'll put in the link in the video information below. Suffragettes also fought alongside abolitionists who believed that freedom and political rights were a universal fight. However, they were dismayed when the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote could not be denied, based on race. Did not include a provision on gender as well. Also, throughout the 1800s, women were leading the temperance movement to limit alcohol use and abuse. Okay, now let's take a look at the changes. In this era, for the first time, we see the rise of prominent female leaders who are nationally recognized. A few examples include Carrie Nation and her temperance followers, as they smashed barrels of alcohol and held temperance rallies. Several leaders of the suffrage movement became well known. Two of these were Susan B. Anthony, seen as the mother of the movement, and Alice Paul, who led the fiery new generation of suffragettes. On to some social developments. There were now more college-educated women, some with leading roles in the social gospel and progressive movements. The best example of this is Jane Addams and the Hull House movement to help immigrants Americanize. Divorce rates also rose as some women left traditional gender roles. However, it is nowhere near the spike in divorce rates from the 1970s onward. Finally, constrictive clothing gave way to more natural styles. Legally, the landmark Supreme Court case, Mueller v. Oregon, ruled a law that limited a woman's workday to 10 hours was constitutional. This was both good and bad for women. Women were being exploited in the workforce. However, a law like this may end up limiting employment opportunity. Next, World War I brought some dramatic short-term change in both progressive and regressive directions. Women entered the workforce in significant numbers during the war. However, this was short-lived, as once the war was over and men returned, along with a recession, women lost most of those jobs. The war did help boost support for women's suffrage, though. Towards the end of the era, there were two monumental victories. Throughout the time period, states were granting women the right to vote, especially states in the western half of the country. The suffrage movement would culminate with the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote across the whole country. Also, the 18th Amendment had passed in 1919. While not specifically a women's rights focus, however, the movement had been led by women for decades. I want to wrap this up with a short reflection on the information and ask the question, did this era produce great social and political change for women? Some say yes, and point to the political victories and to a few females gaining prominence in athletics, cinema, political figures, and changes in women's fashion, especially in the 1920s. My opinion is no, there was not a lot of change. And it's not because of a lack of effort. That was most definitely there. However, the cult of domesticity and separate spheres were strong social forces, and those ideals never really went away. Maybe their influence decreased slightly, but still they dominated. The women who did gain prominence in any sphere were few and far between. Also, the emerging consumer culture and media reinforced the cult of domesticity. And finally, there were no equal pay acts, legalized birth control, civil rights, or anti-discrimination acts. It would be decades until any of that was achieved. And while we still have a ways to go in our present era, I know I'm cherry picking a stat here, but I think it still says a lot. Last year saw an all-time record of females as head of Fortune 500 companies. That is the largest 500 companies in the United States. That total was 33. And why did the US get involved in World War I? If we were in a world history class, our main kind of reasons we'd look at is the acronym MAIN. So militarism, European militaries had been increasing their military strength for decades. Alliances, the alliance system made it more likely that even if a country was not attacked, they had to get involved because an ally was attacked. Imperialism, European powers were competing and struggling for power on the world stage as they took over Asian and African countries. And nationalism, strong uniting force within countries. That helped Germany and Italy, but it also caused a lot of problems within empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the war initially breaks out with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist, and also the Ottoman Empire. So these are the reasons in world history. And the war breaks out in 1914. But the United States doesn't get involved until 1917. So these are not the reasons for the US involvement in World War I. For those, we need to first kind of take a look at foreign policy prior to World War I. So first, let's take a look at recent foreign policy of the previous presidents running up to World War I. First off, you had Teddy Roosevelt with his big stick, meaning strong military foreign policy. He focused on America becoming a major world power and the ability for America to exert its influence. He really wanted to kind of follow in the model of the European countries like Germany and Great Britain of establishing some sort of overseas empire. And he focused more so on Latin America. Then the next president after him was Taft, and that was dollar diplomacy he used. So he wanted to use the great economic might of the United States to exert influence. By this point in time, America either has the strongest economy or the second strongest economy to Great Britain in the entire world. And so with that, we're able to, both with our private business, but also our government, able to, throw some dollars around the world and buy influence. And then we had President Wilson, and his was a Wilsonian democracy. So lead by a democratic example. And he'll have some very strong ideas about like free trade and free markets and exporting American democracy abroad. So a very idealistic kind of foreign policy. But all three of these kind of go together for what we have for our foreign policy today. So as mentioned before, the war breaks out in 1914, and the US does not enter. It's for a couple of different reasons. One is the war is mostly on European soil, dealing with European powers. And going back to Washington's farewell address way back in period 3 for APUSH, Washington had warned the US, trade with the rest of the world, but stay out of European alliances and European wars. And the majority of the public was not clamoring for war either. There were many recent German immigrants, and it was iffy on where their alliances would be. And there is no real bad guy in World War I. There are no Nazis, and it really kind of looks like war just between major powers of Europe, struggling for influence and control. And Wilson's re-election campaign completely centered around how, quote, he kept us out of war. You can see the campaign button over there on the right. And Wilson was able to win re-election on that. Now, the U.S. does trade with warring countries, mostly with Great Britain and France. This is partly because Great Britain controls the seas, has control of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, they have control of the Atlantic Ocean above the water, but German U-boats are disrupting trade under the water. And there are attempts to destroy any armaments that are going between America and Great Britain. And officially, America was not supposed to be trading guns with Great Britain. It was just supposed to be trading things like food. However, this was being done. So this leads to some problems for the U.S. So the first of these incidents happens in 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania. It had over 100 Americans on it and actually over 1,000 people on it. German submarines had suspected that it was carrying armaments, which would break some international treaties. And they sunk the ship, and the American press didn't talk about how there might have been armaments on that. They just kind of played up the fact that it was over 100 Americans on there, and this was seen as an act of aggression. President Wilson gave a stern warning to Germany not to ever do that again. And Germany responds to say, okay, we'll have the Sussex Pledge. We agree to visit and search all vessels before sinking them to confirm if they actually have armaments or not. In January 1917, Germany resumes unlimited submarine warfare. This is because Germany was suffering greatly from a blockade that the British had on them, and Germany couldn't have a blockade in return on Great Britain. So Great Britain was able to tap into its vast colonial resources, while Germany was fast running out of resources, especially food. And they decided to just throw all their eggs into one basket of trying to cut their rival off, Great Britain, from resources. So they said, all right, we're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare and try to cut Great Britain off as well, just like they've cut Germany off. Then the next month, the Zimmermann telegram comes out, and Germany asks Mexico to declare war on the U.S. And in return, Germany will help Mexico regain the Southwest. Now, the Southwest, which would be Mexico's Northwest, that's like California, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Mexico had lost that many years earlier, decades earlier in the Mexican-American War. Now, Mexico is not going to go along with this plan. However, this is published in the American press, and the public and the president are outraged that Germany would propose this to its neighbor, Mexico. Then in March 1917, the Russian Revolution deposes the Tsar, and it really looks like Russia is on the verge of leaving the war. This would be great for Germany, who could then focus more of its resources on the Western Front. And this might lead to a German victory if the U.S. does not step in. So early in April, Wilson will ask Congress for a declaration of war. Now notice, it is a large majority that do vote in favor of war, but there are some, we have 50 in the House who dissent and 6 in the Senate. You know, the war is still not incredibly popular. There are a lot of Americans who are outraged over what Germany has done, but it's not like World War II, where America had been, a military base had been directly attacked. There are some other reasons and arguments for war too. In Wilson's speech, he'll make the argument that the United States needs to make the world safe for democracy, characterize Germany and the Central Powers as the aggressors, and Germany and the Central Powers had lost the public relations battle in the U.S. Even early on in the war. When Germany had invaded Belgium, the American press had played up basically Germany as the aggressor, and that they did a whole bunch of atrocities in Belgium. Some of these things were exaggerated, but Germany was not doing well as far as public relations go in America. And Wilson implies that Germany, if they win, they will threaten democracy everywhere. And this fits with Wilson's own foreign policy beliefs of Wilsonian democracy. Wilson also has grand ideas for a post-war world of free trade and ending colonialism and a variety of things that he would see as a very idealistic world if all of his ideas could come to fruition. So this might be a chance for that. There's also some other reasons too, though. One is American businesses and bankers, they had a lot of ties to Great Britain and France, especially Great Britain. A lot of money had been loaned from American banks to Great Britain so they could continue fighting the war. The war was extremely expensive for these European powers. So if Great Britain and France lost, it would have been devastating to the American financial system. They could not expect those loans to be repaid, because then they would have to be repaying Germany for being on the losing end of the war. So you have kind of the more idealistic kind of reason here for making the world safe for democracy, and maybe less idealistic, but just more pragmatic when it comes to the financial system. In this video, we are looking at the continuities and changes in foreign policy between 1914 and 1941. So from the beginning of World War I to the beginning of World War II. Below, you see a famous political cartoon that features an Uncle Sam resting on a Keystone block for the League of Nations. This is a good depiction of American foreign policy in the time period. It has the ability to lead, and even comes up with great ideas like the League of Nations. However, fails to take the reins, as there are internal debates and division over how engaged the U.S. should be on the world stage. Let's start out with changes. Early in the time period, there is a significant change. When World War I broke out, President Wilson and most of the general public wanted to remain neutral. The president even centered his re-election campaign around it, as his slogan was, "He kept us out of the war." However, because of escalating events, German acts of aggression, Wilson's desire to make the world safe for democracy, and U.S. interests in seeing Great Britain and France prevail, the U.S. entered the war in 1917. In the following years, as the Allied powers defeated the Central Powers, the United States was in a strong position to shape the future of global relations. Wilson had a very ambitious plan he called 14 points. A few of the details in the plan included a League of Nations, which would be an international government that could resolve disputes before war broke out. Also, freedom of the seas, open agreements, and an end to colonialism that Wilson termed self-determination. However, in a continuing theme in this video, there was internal divisions in the U.S. about how much of a role the U.S. should play. Senators, notoriously Henry Cabot Lodge, voiced disagreement with the League of Nations and worried that it would sacrifice American sovereignty. Lodge had an influence in the Senate, and as a result, the Senate would not ratify the treaty, leaving the U.S. out of the League of Nations. The 1920s saw a series of more conservative presidents and less engaged foreign policy. Internally, the U.S. worried about immigration and its effects on national identity. Some xenophobic Americans felt radical ideas, especially socialism, were creeping into the U.S. There was also rampant racism, as the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan rose to great heights. The National Origins Act severely limited immigration from everywhere except white Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries, and completely banned immigration from Asia. However, the U.S. still engaged with the world economically. Its economy was the strongest and was able to project great influence over the global economy. Okay, now let's go through the changes during the critical time period of the 1930s. From 1933 to 1939, there was a split between President Roosevelt and the American people in regards to foreign policy. During the time, America was dealing with the Great Depression, and Roosevelt was busy working on implementing the New Deal. However, Roosevelt was also keeping his eye on global events, and he was worried about the rise and expansion of Japan and the rise of Nazi Germany. But back in Congress, the Nye Committee was set up to investigate profiteering of U.S. companies during World War I. Many of the American people looked at World War I with derision and questioned the necessity of involvement in the previous World War, and wanted to stay out of any future European conflicts. In the mid to late 1930s, Congress passed neutrality acts almost every year, which limited the U.S. ability to trade with, provide loans, or aid any country involved in war. The purpose was to keep America from becoming entangled in another great war like what happened in World War I. But this also hamstrung President Roosevelt's ability to address growing conflicts and tensions. Also in the late 1930s into the early 1940s, the American public themselves became very vocal on the anti-war front. The American First Committee, a citizens' anti-war group that would go on to boast more than 800,000 members and led by Charles Lindbergh, gave speeches and held rallies across the country criticizing Roosevelt and his actions. One specific action was Roosevelt's attempts at aiding allied Great Britain that was under siege from the Nazi Luftwaffe. Roosevelt tried to get around the neutrality acts by lending instead of selling Great Britain ships and other supplies in exchange for leases to various ports around the world. All debates about interventionism would end, though, on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. From that point on, America would be fully engaged in the Second World War and beyond. Like a few other CCOT videos, you might be asking, where are the continuities? It is much easier to identify the changes because things change all the time, but we can find a few continuities in foreign policy. The first is the U.S. always maintained engagement with the world. Some will say the 1920s were an era of isolationism, but even then we see the U.S. leading the way on disarmament with the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and attempts at world peace with the Kellogg-Briand Act in 1928. Also, until Pearl Harbor, there was always a strand of isolationism present. World War I was not universally popular, as seen in the protests during it and subsequent attempts to squash those protests with the Sedition Act that was used on multiple occasions to silence dissent. Two cases in particular that were taken to the Supreme Court were Schneck v. United States and Debs v. United States. Of course, then we see the U.S. staying out of the League of Nations and those neutrality acts. So America played a balancing act in this time period that I think can be categorized as cautious interventionism. Today we are putting into historical context the first Red Scare, which occurred roughly from 1919 to the early 1920s. Below are three famous political cartoons related to our topic today. The first one on the left is a disheveled Uncle Sam looking over the world's melting pot. What you probably cannot see are the words that are written in the pot, which are red flag, Bolshevism, un-American ideals, anarchy, and IWW, which stands for the International Workers' Union. At the top is the phrase, quote, "We cannot digest this scum." This cartoon is basically saying the United States, a usual place for refuge of immigrants, cannot take in people with these radical socialist beliefs. The middle cartoon is pretty straightforward, which is equating union activities like strikes and walkouts as a slippery slope to disorder, riots, murder, Bolshevism, communism, and then chaos. And finally, on the right is a political cartoon that relates to one of the effects of the Red Scare, which is the National Origins Act that attempts to cut off immigration. Okay, now let's get into some of the causes of the first Red Scare. First, a little disclaimer, socialists and anarchists are being combined. I know there's a big difference between these two groups' ideology, but they tended to get lumped together in this era as political radicals. So even if it was an anarchist that assassinated the president, the general public did not differentiate between anarchist or socialist. Okay, so going back to the late 1800s, there was an incredible increase in union membership. And while most members of a union just wanted better pay and safer working conditions, there were some members that were more radical and had socialist leanings. In 1886, the Knights of Labor, a large union, organized what was supposed to be a peaceful demonstration in Chicago. However, it turned violent when a political radical threw a homemade bomb at police, killing 7 officers. This incident gave unions a bad name, and some of the public associated them with socialist radicals. In 1901, President McKinley was assassinated by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. Again, another bad mark for immigrants and political radicals. During World War I, the Russian Revolution occurred, which ushered in the Bolsheviks, who brought communism to that state and assassinated the Tsar. Also, back in the U.S., there was a fairly popular Union and Socialist leader named Eugene V. Debs, who ran for president twice, and as you can see, received a significant amount of votes. He was also jailed during and after World War I for violating the Sedition Act when he spoke out against the war. Now, looking specifically at the Red Scare, after World War I concluded in 1918, American authorities saw a threat of the Russian Revolution spreading to the U.S. They used as evidence for this the actions by some unions and activities of radicals, including the general strike in Seattle, the Boston police strike, and anarchist bombing campaign. The Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer led the government's attempt to suppress radical organizations by raiding them, conducting illegal search and seizures, unwarranted arrests and detentions, and deporting hundreds of suspected radical immigrants. Peak Red Scare came when the government warned of mass violence on May Day. Nothing happened, though, and Palmer lost public support for the raids. However, there was lasting effects of the Red Scare hysteria. Finally, let's look at some of the effects. The first Red Scare definitely contributes to the xenophobic anti-immigrant attitudes of the 1920s. One of the hallmarks of this is the Sacco and Vanzetti case, in which 2 Italian and politically radical immigrants were found guilty of murder on very flimsy evidence. For several years, there was a public debate about the trial that was a proxy for attitudes about immigrants. Eventually, following appeals and reviews, the 2 would be executed in 1927. Next is the National Origins Act of 1924, which instituted a strict quota system for immigration for most countries and totally banned Asians. And lastly, we saw the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan, this time as a powerful political organization. There were chapters across the United States, and many politicians were also Klan members. They advocated for a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant-dominated society and worried that immigrants and minorities would one day outnumber WASP. We're looking at what were the causes of the economic boom of the 1920s. This time period is also called the Roaring Twenties, mostly because of its economy. So why did the U.S. experience so much growth in that decade? Before getting into the causes, let's take a brief look at the context. In the late 1800s to early 1900s, the U.S. had undergone the Industrial Revolution. Great factories sprung up in rapidly growing cities. The factories used scientific management or Taylorism to mass-produce goods on scales never before seen. This helped vault the U.S. into one of the largest economies in the world. In 1914, World War I broke out in Europe, and the U.S. joined the Great War in 1917. In 1918, the Spanish flu, a global pandemic, broke out and spread like wildfire across the world. The end of the war and the Spanish flu helped to sink the U.S. into a deep but luckily short recession from 1919 to 1921. After the short recession, the U.S. economy would boom. Let's take a look at those causes now. First, U.S. industry had been boosted by World War I as lucrative government contracts for supplies were given to big corporations. Secondly, the 1920s saw a return to pro-business government. This is in contrast to the previous progressive era in which presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were more active in regulating industry. In the 1920s, Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover were more friendly to business and embraced a laissez-faire, or government hands-off, approach to the economy. Their stance can best be summed up nicely by Coolidge's phrase from a speech, "The business of America is business." Third were the protectionist tariffs passed in 1922 that made American products cheaper than foreign products. Fourth was the mass production of new consumer goods. Some examples include cars, radios, refrigerators, and toasters. Finally, our last reason was the explosion of buying products on credit or debt. Consumers had wide access to installment plans. So for expensive products like a car, they could agree to monthly payments instead of paying in full up front. Finally, let's take a look at a famous case study of the Roaring '20s, Henry Ford. Ford, as you know, was the founder of Ford Motor Company. The automobile industry experienced the greatest boom of all industries and was central to the overall strong economy of the 1920s. Over a decade before the 1920s, Henry Ford had set out to build a car everyone could afford. Up to that time, only the wealthy had the funds to buy an automobile. Henry Ford was able to reduce the price from $1,200 a car in 1909 to just $295 for a car in 1928. He was able to do this by taking scientific management, as I say, putting that concept on steroids. He built massive production facilities and utilized economies of scale and figured out how his employees could be hyper efficient in the production of an automobile. At the end of the 1920s, Ford was producing one car every minute, an incredible feat. Ford also paid his employees well, as he wanted them to be able to afford the products that they were making, and felt higher pay would lead to more productive workers and great demand for products as workers had more money to spend. And to top off the importance of the car industry, it was not just cars themselves that influenced the economy, but all the products that go into making a car. Those industries saw incredible boosts because of the increase in car production and sales, including steel, rubber, glass, and leather products. Today, we have a huge topic to cover: the continuities and changes over time, the role of government in the economy. On the bottom, we see a famous political cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt looking over a pile of vile and rotten meat that he is attempting to clean up. This is a great example of government action in the economy in this era. First, let's take a bird's eye view of the time period. We have two distinct ways the government interacts with the economy, and it waffles back and forth between them. On the left, from 1890 to 1900, and again from 1920 to 1930, we have the laissez-faire eras. These were times in which the government tried to be mostly hands-off with the economy in support of a big business. This includes what is termed as the Gilded Age and then the later Roaring '20s. Both time periods see conservative presidential administrations. The 1920s were somewhat of a reaction to the previous 20 years of progressive government. Speaking of which, that is the other eras on the left, from 1900 to 1920 and 1930 to 1939. These time periods are characterized by government intervention in the economy, so the opposite of laissez-faire. The first time period is known as Progressive Era, and the second is the Great Depression and New Deal time period. There are some very well-known progressive presidents during these eras, including Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These eras were reactions to the problems from the laissez-faire time periods. Okay, let's take a look at a few details about the laissez-faire eras. And this is in no way comprehensive. I am just highlighting a few key items. In the 1890 to 1900 time period, conservative governments wanted to maintain the gold standard, support industry, and keep a hands-off approach to the economy. They fought off the populist movement, unions, and in general, calls for more intervention. The shining example of this is the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, which was meant to break up monopolies, but instead the government used it against unions in this era. In the 1920 to 1930 era, Warren G. Harding ran a campaign around a return to normalcy, which meant taking a step back from the progressive reforms of the previous 20 years. Overall, the 1920s were very conservative, and it was not just the role of government in the economy. The next president, Calvin Coolidge, philosophy can be best summarized by a phrase from a speech he gave. Quote, "The business of America is business." He was the least active modern president. The last president of this era was Herbert Hoover, who wrote a speech entitled Rugged Individualism, stating that it was the American identity of individuals to take sole responsibility for themselves and not look to the government for welfare. So what caused these eras to end? In 1900, progressives in both parties picked up on populist positions and the general public's calls for reform. And towards the end of the 1920s and into the 30s, America was hit by the Great Depression. Now let's take a look at the progressive era. And again, this is in no way comprehensive. I am just highlighting a few key details to give you an idea of the era and give good outside evidence for an essay on the topic. Running from 1900 to 1920, it saw three reform-minded presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. They used the Sherman and later Clayton Antitrust Acts to break up monopolies. In response to muckraking author Upton Sinclair in his book The Jungle, Teddy Roosevelt guided through Congress and signed the Meat Inspection Act and Food and Drug Acts. These are examples of direct government intervention in the economy with regulatory agencies to protect the consumer. Later in the Wilson administration, the Keating-Owing Child Labor Act was passed, which forbade interstate trade of goods that were made by child labor, effectively ending legal child labor. The 16th Amendment was also passed in this era, which instituted the income tax, and the Federal Reserve Act was passed, which created a national banking system. The purpose was an attempt to halt the cycle of panics or deep recessions, with a national bank controlling the supply of money and interest rates. And they're still working on how to do that effectively today. Our last time period within this overall era is the 1930s. The stock market crashed in late 1929, and the Great Depression lasted the entire 1930s decade. Hoover was president when it first began and was reluctant to act, thinking the market would correct on its own. However, by 1932, it still had not, and even the conservative Hoover acquiesced and began government intervention programs, one of which was the RFC, which provided financial support to state and local governments, loans to banks and railroads. He also signed into action infrastructure projects, the most well-known is the Hoover Dam. Hoover lost the 1932 election to Franklin Roosevelt, who promised Americans a New Deal, which meant government intervention the likes that had never before been seen. There are many New Deal programs, of which I will not go through all of them, but here are a few highlighted ones. They can be divided into direct relief for suffering Americans, economic recovery, and permanent reform. First, FERA or FERA, which helped to provide basic necessity for citizens. And Social Security, which we still have, is a pension program for the elderly and permanently injured. The NIRA relaxed antitrust laws while encouraging, and some historians to say compelling, cooperation between business, workers, and government. The government gave guidelines to businesses for workers' hours, pay, and quality standards. And finally, a permanent reform example is the FDIC, which was meant to return confidence in the banking system as the government would insure savings accounts. So if a bank failed, the customers would not lose their money. You might be asking, was there any continuities in this era? Well, there are a few. First, the subject of tariffs. These are taxes on imported goods and are meant to protect American industry from foreign competition. While President Wilson discussed the prospect of it, a real push for free global trade never materialized. Tariffs were adjusted throughout the time period, but they were always kept and sometimes increased. The most famous example is the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which many economists think made the Great Depression worse. A greater or more bird's eye view of the era shows the United States capitalistic-based economy was maintained. Yes, there were some major changes that tweaked capitalism, but there was no overhaul and change to another system, specifically socialism, in which some countries in that era did see that overhaul, namely Russia. The US did end up with a more mixed economy by the end, but never fully went into socialism. Lastly, the powerful ideal of the American dream maintained throughout the era. It is the idea that in America, there is opportunity to succeed if a person has high aspirations and a great work ethic. This ideal is immortalized in the popular Horatio Alger stories of the era. The Great Depression and New Deal. I'm also going to discuss the Dust Bowl and its effects. Below you see one of the most recognizable images from U.S. history, Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, shot at a pea picker camp in California. This image has come to define the hardship of the era. First, let's take a look at the previous decade to set up our topic. The Roaring '20s are known as the decade of economic growth due to new consumer goods like radios and affordable cars. Cities were alive with development. and there was a thriving underworld of speakeasies and the mob taking advantage of prohibition. The federal government was conservative and business-friendly, headed by Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, although Hoover's time with a booming economy was very short-lived. This was also an era defined by anti-immigrant and xenophobic attitudes, as seen in the Sacco and Vanzetti case, National Origins Act of 1924, which set quotas, and the second rise of the KKK. In the South, the Jim Crow segregation era continued, with African Americans stuck in perpetual poverty because of sharecropping cycle of debt. Some African Americans migrated to northern cities during and after World War I. They were met with racism in the North and relegated to specific neighborhoods. Some of those neighborhoods flourished. A great example is Harlem, where we saw the development of jazz and many great works from Black writers, thinkers, and artists. The Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt with the Great Depression. A myriad of problems caused the economy to completely tank. Some of these include the collapse of the banking system, the stock market crash, decline in world trade, and an increase in inventories of goods not flying off the shelf anymore. These issues led to a rapid increase in unemployment, which hit 25% in 1932. This led to homelessness, as camps of homeless dubbed Hoovervilles, as many blamed President Hoover for not doing enough to alleviate the situation. Lastly, another example of how dire the situation was. World War I veterans were promised a retirement bonus, and many of them were demanding an early payment as they were struggling mightily. These veterans marched on Washington and made a camp there. Police and military forces broke up the camp in what would be the final nail in the coffin of Hoover's presidency. In the midst of the Great Depression, ecological disaster occurred on the Great Plains and spread across the country. Millions of acres of farmland was destroyed, and the entire population of the midsection of the country was in dire straits. California had some need for agricultural labor and placed some ads around the country. However, far, far more showed up than there was work for. Around 2.5 million people in total migrated away from the Dust Bowl states, and California did not have enough work for them. The migrants were met with derision. A favorite book of mine that covers this era is The Grapes of Wrath, and definitely worth checking out. Finally, let's take a general look at the New Deal itself. This will be just a broad overview. If you'd like more depth, I made another video about the continuities and changes of government's role in the economy. FDR swept into office with a lot of public enthusiasm. He brought in academics that he called his brain trust to come up with ideas to provide relief to the poor, economic recovery, and long-term reform. This would see the government take on new roles in the economy, like insuring savings accounts, hiring millions of Americans in various programs, and an old age pension program, Social Security. Some of these programs were thrown out by the conservative Supreme Court. Roosevelt threatened to add justices and pack the court. He would back down from the idea, and the Supreme Court backed off a bit from throwing out his New Deal programs. Overall, the New Deal had a mixed result in combating the Great Depression. It definitely lifted the spirits of many Americans, and it also made long-term changes in the role of government in the economy and people's lives. But it did not totally revive the economy. World War II would accomplish that, but with a terrible loss of life. Okay, that does it for contextualizing the Great Depression. Like the video and subscribe to the channel for more AP exam review videos and primary source analysis.